Hello, and welcome to Part 8 of the Praxis Table Talks analysis of Julius Evola's Revolt against the Modern World. We are your hosts. My name is Vincent. I'm the founder of Praxia, and with me I have Cody, a member of our Leadership Council. Good to have you.
Hello again, everyone. Not like I've gone anywhere else, but yes, I am here again.
Yeah, I know the way I worded that, it made it seem as if you were gone, but no, you are here. And so today, this is the last... it's our first analysis on the second half of the book. We've already mentioned that Evola has separated this into two parts, and each part has a different purpose. The first part outlines the doctrine of the capital T traditionalist point of view, and the second part outlines the histories of various traditional societies and their descent from their active relationship with the way of being into their relationship that we see today with the way of becoming. So, before we go on, what were your thoughts on reading these chapters and, your introduction into the second part?
From my own first dives into esoteric readings of history, especially what's often referred to as pre-Diluvian history, I've come to many of the conclusions that Evola came of that were obviously separate from Evola's work. And I have some theories of my own on what might have occurred and how civilization might have looked like beforehand. But I think it's very fascinating how well articulated and sourced that Evola's picture of this pre-Diluvian world looked like, and how well documented it actually was from the words of the ancients, and how even they referred to this civilization as ancient, and that it did exist and exceed heights of technology and power beyond that which they could replicate post-flood or post dawn of civilization, as is contemporarily looked at in historic circles. I also thought it was strange on Evola bringing up parts of, human genealogy in a way, comparing different hominids like the Cro-Magnons and other, human groups that existed in this sort of dawn of the Ice Age type of period, which seems kind of contradictory towards his stance against evolution and evolutionism. But how he spun it was that they were actually still a degeneration from these Hyperborean civilizations, but still a superior quality of man than is today, whereas archaeologists, paleontologists, and anthropologists and so forth would look at Cro-Magnon as a lower step in the evolution of mankind,
Right.
from the pre-Ice Age civilizations. And I thought that was it seemed almost out of place, but considering the context of everything we've already looked at and where we're going, I think that it's going to be very prescient, not just in Evola's own work, but in how we apply this elsewhere, outside into the real world.
Right. In the various civilizational, I guess, the references that he pulls, he also examines that there are different relationships between different peoples who are in different stages of their own cycle of decline. So you have, he mentions, I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but he mentions a cycle that begins in the south and a cycle that begins in the north. And these two cycles, he says that the southern one is a little bit older than the northern one and is distinct from it. So that's something that we're going to get into as well. But yes, the chapters that we're going to... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just want to add, too, that his mention of those cycles and the shift in the poles to those cycles from north to south or south to north, whichever one predated whichever, and then going from east to west was interesting, too, and how he connected that with the shift in the Earth's rotational pole, and how that dramatically affects the weather and the implications thereof, that he he gets into and that we'll get into in a short time. But very, very interesting how he can connect these very scientifically grounded concepts with these very esoteric readings of history as well.
Right. And the other thing is that if you were to read these, a good way to position yourself is from the point of view of the scientific understanding of René Guénon or the traditionalists as well. And I think that Evola is here trying not to discredit the actual findings of scientific research, but instead to take a look at these findings from a different perspective, in the sense that you have fact and you have truth, and fact might support different opinions, but to look at it from the eye of truth, there is only one certain truth that these facts all support. It's the difference between fact and truth. And I think what he's doing is examining the facts that we know and trying to put them in line in a certain correspondence with truth. And I think he does a good job at that in these chapters.
Absolutely. And I think that's what you could discern Evola as being more of a true scientist than many of the academics we have in institutions today, because he's actually using the scientific method and many, just Socratic modes of questioning to go through and actually analyze the facts and try to get at an unbiased truth. Whereas we have such an alienation and bastardization of what the scientific method as a tool is meant to be. And so we often forget what, men like Evola and men that predated him in the turn of the last century, around that, Victorian age of exploration and science, were doing and pushing the bounds of human knowledge in the material world. And that's something that I think he does really, really well, and still holding true to the spiritual essence of our beings.
Right. Absolutely. So the chapters that we're going to deal with today are chapters 22, the Doctrine of the Four Ages, chapters 23, the Golden Age, 24, the Pole and the Hyperborean region, 25, the Northern Atlantic Cycle, 26, North and South, and 27, Civilization of the Mother. And there's a chance that we might not reach all of these chapters today. So if this episode is split into two, here's the preliminary warning as to that happening. But hopefully we can cover all of these today and still touch upon them with the amount of detail of which they are deserving. So Evola starts the second part of this book out with a small introduction. He references that in the first part he uses a sort of he calls it a typological or a morphological analytic character, in which he analyzes the common characteristics of traditional societies. So what he would do in the first part is he would pull certain concepts or institutions or practices or traditions or rituals or symbols. He would pull them regardless of how long they truly remain traditional, or regardless of whether or not the character of the civilization in which they were employed was truly traditional. So it could be a civilization in the midst of a cycle of decline that has this one aspect about it that is, remains holistic and representative of the idea Evola wants to touch upon. And so he will then pull that example from that civilization and examine it sort of in a vacuum, sort of independently. And he would not examine the relationship between the given tradition and the historic context in which it was instituted. So he wouldn't say, for example, that he wouldn't examine tradition in a sort of context or in a contextual manner, but he would examine it in sort of a principled manner, in the way of examining different ideas and how they relate back to this one holistic idea of capital T tradition. And then he would use that idea to describe, or he would use that manifestation to describe the idea in general. I brought this up earlier. He references, think of the solar principle or the Olympian principle being sort of the same idea. When he mentions the Olympian principle, you can very well understand that he's referencing the solar principle, that type of idea. And so the anti-traditional ideals, or the improper forces at work in a given society, did not invalidate the traditional principle that he described in isolation. That's what I wanted to get at. And so the first section was those isolated aspects, and now in the second section, it is these aspects integrated in a certain context, in the context of history. He describes now the histories of the various cycles. He begins this section by outlining the doctrine of the four ages, which is kind of done in the same fashion as he wrote the first part, but then in the chapters after that, he gets into actually examining the histories of these various peoples. As Cody was saying earlier, these esoteric histories, these pre-Diluvian, very, very prehistoric histories, beginning with the Hyperboreans, and he pays homage to the idea of the Lemurians, which is that southern side. And then he examines these traditional societies as they undergo this cycle of decline, this doctrine of the four ages, from their golden seat, in their spot in the golden age to, their first derivation, their second derivation, and so on and so forth until he reaches the end of the Kali Yuga. So that's how he structured the second part of the book. And the second part acts more like a timeline.
I would like to interject.
Sure.
I would like to interject real quick that saying the analyzing the prehistoric history is pretty oxymoronic in a very funny way.
It is, but that's exactly
the only way you can really say it.
It's exactly.
I give it to you, but it gave me a chuckle.
Yeah. The second part acts more like a timeline of traditional societies that were sort of legitimated for a time by capital T traditional principles and the decadence that they underwent. And so the second part deals a lot with, mythological and esoteric history, and it dives deep into the occult ideas, like I said earlier, of prehistoric peoples and locations which no longer exist or only exist in a decayed form. So he never really concludes a true form of each of these societies as well, but he does allude to their possible locations and their hierarchical structures. So everything he says in here is done with this, I don't want to say vagueness, but it is done with this very non-conclusive tone. Well, obviously he does make these, broad generalizational conclusive statements, but he doesn't make any very specific conclusive statements about the exact location, and that's really all you can do when dealing with prehistory. But the first part of this
I wanted to add, and that is going back to that scientific approach that he is giving towards these things, because evidence points towards a certain direction on where these civilizations might have lied, what migration patterns might have occurred just based off of the word of mouth of various different traditions and the analogs throughout many different civilizations. But there isn't any concrete proof, especially not archaeological proof. And
he gets to
I will
justify
just mention this, I think, in this chapter.
Yeah,
that it's time has gone by so long, and the elements have been so hectic in these areas that, of course, no matter what man makes in wherever they are, time and the weather is just going to erode everything. So it's difficult.
It is also kind of the only way to piece together prehistory is to examine historic societies. And this bodes very well for the idea of perennialism or of a primordial tradition, because each of the elements in the societies that he examines very clearly are a derivation of a similar former idea, in the same way that you would say that the Latin languages are derivations of Latin itself. You can find in these traditional civilizations, whether it be, Western Hemisphere or Eastern Hemisphere, whether it be in the Americas or in Europe or in Asia, you can find similarities, not just in the principles that they touch upon, but in the way in which they touch upon these principles and the way they express them even. For example, there are certain names in Aztec and Mayan civilizations that correspond to names in the Greek language, which, if we were to, position ourselves from a historic perspective, these two civilizations had no contact with each other whatsoever. yet they both have very distinct names for certain places and certain things that sound almost alike. And you can see the linguistic relationship because of the principled relationship of what it is that that word is referencing. It's very interesting stuff, and we'll be getting into that in this episode.
And even some texts that allude to, just like with Mayan and Greek civilizations, pointing towards or alluding to similar ancient civilizations like Atlantis that they get to as well, which I think Evola mentions a little bit further on as well.
Yeah, exactly. Very interesting stuff in these chapters, and I actually really do like the second part of this book. It is very good read from start to finish, and it is set up very well by the first part. So the first chapter that we're going to examine here is the Doctrine of the Four Ages. Do you have anything else to say before we jump into that?
Nope.
All right, sounds good. In that case, the Doctrine of the Four Ages is the first chapter of the second part of the book, and this was a very prominent idea for the proponents of capital T tradition. And I'm sure we are all familiar with the idea of the Doctrine of the Four Ages by now in this part of the book, with reference to the Kali Yuga and whatsoever. But an interesting note before we actually jump into this. This was something that I have been wanting to say on this podcast for quite some time, but I've never really found a place in which to say it. But it is very interesting information. So we'll get into that first. So, as I said, the Doctrine of the Four Ages was a very prominent idea for the proponents of capital T traditionalism. Now, I was watching a podcast by a man named Syed Nizamuddin Ahmad, and he is a professor, I believe, of Islamic studies. He is a Muslim himself, and he has a very big occult sciences library, among other things, and he's very well learned in religious studies and things like that. And so he actually is the one who I got a lot of this information from. It was this podcast that I got a lot of this information from. And after I watched that, I did some research of my own just so I could piece together the information I received from that podcast and provide a little bit more of it myself. But I would like to give him credit just because, if I were to have done something like that, I would have wanted credit myself. So there's his credit. Go check out that podcast. I will link it in the description below. It's a very, very good description of the idea of the Doctrine of the Four Ages, according to René Guénon and a few other esotericists, which I'll bring up in a minute. So, the Doctrine of the Four Ages obviously is what corresponds to the decline in human civilization over a given period of time. Each Yuga is an age in a cycle, and as the ages progress, humanity, the qualitative state of humanity, decreases as the ages go on. So as each age is further removed from the golden age, in which there was no bad, right? No sin, no anything. This is pure spirituality. As each age is removed from this time period, you get a decay in the qualitative state of humanity up until the age of darkness, or the Iron Age, or the Kali Yuga, in which there is next to no good. So, and this is very well expressed in Hindu doctrine. This is why Hinduism is the sort of the model on which the Doctrine of the Ages rests. And you can find these in different civilizations as well, but the Hindu doctrine is very well thought out. It is very well calculated, and there's a lot of numbers, and it's very well fleshed out, a very, very, very well fleshed out system. And so if you were to take time as a whole, and we talked about time in the previous episode, and you were to look at these larger enumerations of time that lined up with other enumerations to make even larger units of going back until you have these super huge units of time that the human mind can't even wrap its head around until you get to eternity. The largest of these in Hindu scripture is called the days of Brahma. and Brahma being the, like the highest god. And the days of Brahma are called a kalpa. And a kalpa is an aeonic period of time considered to be between the creation and recreation of a world or a universe, quote unquote, which lasts about 4 billion years. So a kalpa lasts about 4 billion years, and these correspond to a day or a night of Brahma. So 12 hours of a day of Brahma. So each kalpa is 12 hours of Brahma, whatever that means. So a kalpa consists of 14 manvantaras. And a manvantara is considered to be an age of Manu. And Manu is considered to be the archetypal man. It's what we've identified to be Novus Civis. So a manvantara is supposed to be an age of Manu, or an age of the archetypal man. And a kalpa consists of 14 of these. And a manvantara consists of 71 yuga cycles. So in turn, a kalpa consists of 1,000 yuga cycles. And every yuga cycle lasts about 4 million years. So you have the Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga. That's one yuga cycle. And every manvantara consists of 71 of these cycles. And this extends up until you reach the days or nights of Brahma. And so each yuga, like I said, each yuga cycle has the 4 yugas that the traditionalists talk about. And each yuga proper is a division of time in which the general state of humanity, like I said, qualitatively decreases by a fourth of what it was in the previous yuga. So if you have the golden age, like I said, the silver age, the state of humanity will be 1/4 less of what it was in the golden age. In the bronze age, it will be 2/4 less of what it was in the golden age. And in the iron age, it will be 3/4 less, until you get to a state that is so far removed from the golden age that the state of humanity is absolutely decayed and we are into a new cycle. And so the idea here is that every division of time in the yuga cycle can be further divided up according to the Pythagorean tetractys. This is the image that I sent you of the triangle. I will put it up on the screen now. So the Pythagorean tetractys is, let's see here. It's an image in which there are 10 units, 10 dots, 10 points, as it were, and they are organized in the fashion of 4 on the bottom, 3 on the row above, 2 on the row above, and 1 on the top, and it organizes itself into a nice equilateral triangle. And this is used in Pythagorean mathematics or esoteric geometry to represent sort of like the monad, the dyad, the triad, and all of that. There are lots of uses for the Pythagorean tetractys, but what it does, the reason it's relevant to us is because it breaks down units of 10 into divisions of 4, 3, 2, and 1. And so this is how the ages progress, as it were. And so I will give another timeline. This is the second image I sent you with the bronze aged, with the bronze, silver, iron, and gold and whatnot. I put that up on the screen now too. So if you look at the second image, there's a sort of timeline of 10 units, and 4 of these units are taken up by a golden period, 3 of these units are taken up by a silver period, 2 of these units are taken up by a bronze period, and 1 of these units is taken up by an iron period. So the period of time that corresponds to the golden age is obviously the Satya Yuga, or the first Yuga. The second is the silver age, or the Treta Yuga. And the third, with the number 2 that corresponds to 2 units, is the bronze age, the third age, or the Dwapara Yuga. And then the last one, of course, is the Kali Yuga. And so the Kali Yuga is 1/10 of a Yuga cycle, whereas the Golden Age, for example, is 4/10 of a Yuga cycle. So they take up they take up shorter periods of time as the ages progress. The decay sort of snowballs, and it becomes more rapid as it descends. So, like I said, these were divided up into proportions of units.
You're fueling the fire of accelerationism.
Exactly. No, but it's true. As these, even in the timelines, this is not just Hindu, but I've used Hindu as an example. It's as the decay progresses, it becomes more rapid. It's very, it's very interesting. So anyways, different calculations existed for these durations depending on the source. Like I said, the Greeks had a similar idea for cyclical time, in which the Yugas, like I said, corresponded to the golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages. Like I said, the golden age corresponds to the Satya Yuga, silver to the Treta Yuga, bronze to the Dwapara Yuga, and the iron to the Kali Yuga. Now, Rene Guénon, who is the progenitor of the traditionalist ideas before Evola, was a very big inspiration on Evola's writing. He suggested that a Yuga cycle, instead of lasting, 1,000 years? No, 4 million years. He suggested that a Yuga cycle, instead of lasting 4 million years, actually lasted 64,800 years. And so that would mean that a Yuga cycle, like I said, is 64,800 years. That if you do these divisions, as it were, the Satya Yuga would last about 25,920 years. The Treta Yuga would last about 19,440 years. The Dwapara Yuga would last about 12,960 years, and the Kali Yuga would be 1/10 of that. It would last 6,400 years, or 6,480 years. Now, most sources, whether it be Hindu scripture or Guénon or Robert Bolton, who's another person I'll bring up in a minute, most of these sources state that the Kali Yuga started in 3102 BC. So according to these calculations, if you were to take these durations of time that Guénon stated, the Kali Yuga will end in 3378 AD. But the thing is that Guénon himself was a bit vague with his calculations, and he didn't claim to know all the answers. So he didn't really use the 4321 idea as we have outlined it here. So more relevant to this idea is a man named Robert Bolton, who was an English academic and theologian. And Robert Bolton lived from 1572 to 1631. And he tried to determine and predict the actual durations for these various segments of time. So he was more interested in the, figuring out when the Kali Yuga will actually end and what these events correspond to. So, according to him, the Kali Yuga, or the Iron Age, still began in 3102, I believe it was. Yeah, 3102. And it will end in 2082 AD. So, in about 59 years. And so this means that there are 5,184 years in the Kali Yuga, and that to times that by 10 would give us a Yuga cycle of 51,840 years. That would mean that the Golden Age began in 49,000 BC, Silver Age in 29,000 BC, Bronze Age in 13,000 BC, which lasted up until 3,102 BC, and then the Kali Yuga lasts from 3,102 to 2082. Now, if you were to consider only that last segment from 3102 to 2082 and apply the same idea of 4-3-2-1 proportions, apply the same scale. So you're talking about the Iron Age, right? And you're subdividing it into its own golden, silver, bronze, and iron sub-ages, right? You would get these calculations, and these are very interesting. The Golden Age, or the Golden Sub-Age of the Iron Age, is 3102 BC to 1026 BC. That's the Golden Sub-Age of the Iron Age. 1026 BC to 528 AD is the Silver Sub-Age of the Iron Age. And then 528 AD to 1564 is the Bronze Sub-Age. And then from 1564 to 2082 is the Iron Sub-Age, or the Kali Yuga of the Kali Yuga, as it were. But if you look at the Golden Sub-Age of the Iron Age, it corresponds very nicely to the beginning of the first ancient Egyptian dynasty in 3150 BC and the collapse of the Greek Bronze Age in 1050 BC. It almost lines up perfectly. 3102 to 1026 lines up very nicely to 3150 and 1050. And these are, approximations, because we don't actually have the concrete dates for these things. And then if you look at the silver sub-age of the Iron Age, it lines up very nicely with the duration of classical antiquity from 1026 to 528, lines up very nicely with the collapse of the Greek Bronze Age and the duration of classical antiquity up until the fall of the Roman Empire. And then the Bronze sub-age also from 528 to 1564, it corresponds to the medieval period, almost to a T, depending on which scholar you ask. If the fall of the Roman Empire to the colonization of the Americas, it lines up very nicely. And then from 1564 to 2082, it begins with the Protestant Reformation, and it continues until what I would amateurly predict to be the death of secular liberal hegemony. So these line up very nicely. Now, if you were to...
And I just want to say, too, going back to the larger ages from the calculations of Roger... what was it, Roger Bolton?
Robert Bolton.
Which I did hear those... Robert Bolton, excuse me. I did hear those calculations before, but I forgot who it was that made them, because I was going to bring those up, but I didn't want to do so unsourced, so I'm glad you did. His calculations and going back and applying them to the larger scale of the Yuga cycles actually lines up fairly well with geological timeframes and what we understand of the Earth as well, and what we were mentioning of Evola pointing towards the origins of certain civilizations like Hyperborea and Atlantis and whatnot. And though he doesn't make any definitive claims, it points to things like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and Doggerland, which on a time scale of the last ice age, or the glacial maximum, as it's called in many circles, is almost exactly right here with the calculations of the Bronze Age for that period, at least for like the Atlantean devolution there, and then would set again in the thawing off of the Ice Age, going into this post-Diluvian rebirth of civilization in the Iron Age. So I just thought that was interesting as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure I haven't done much research on prehistory as Evola has, or probably as you have even. So I wouldn't be able to comment on anything about, such things. But I think that, yeah, from what I do know, from the little tiny bits that I do know, these ages nicely line up with different events. And they're bound to. The thing is that they're bound to, because this 4321 application corresponds very nicely to the speed of decay in society. So, if you were to once again take that last segment, right? So now you're considering the Iron sub-age of the Iron Age, or what is from 1564 to 2082. If you were just to consider that period, and you were to divide that up into units of 4, 3, 2, and 1. So you're now examining the Iron Age of the Iron Age, or what we call, the Iron. No, you're examining the Iron Age of the Iron Sub-Age, the Iron Age of the Iron Age of the Iron Age. Anyway, if you were to
call it real steel.
Yeah, if you were to examine the Iron period of the Iron Sub-Age, how about that? We'll call it that. You would get a golden period from 1564 to 1770. And then you would get a silver period of 1770 to 1926. You would get a bronze period of 1926 to 2030. And then you would get a iron period from 2030 to 2082. So we would still be in the bronze period. But these are all calculations that are based off of somebody who died before all of these dates that I just mentioned have even come to pass. So the golden period of the Iron Sub-Age from 1564 to 1770, it goes from what is left of the Renaissance and the decaying but still traditional monarchical regimes. It goes up from there up until the birth of the first liberal republics in the 1770s. And then the silver period of 1770 to 1926, those are the early years of American society. And this silver period includes a little bit more decay. The revolutions of 1848. It has emancipation.
Yeah, it'd be the death of European monarchies.
Yeah,
after World War I.
And then you get the Industrial Revolution, the plebeianizing of what was the American pseudo-aristocratic republic, and then, like you said, it culminates in World War I, and then it ends in the interwar years. And then this Bronze period, from 1926 to 2030, it's where the trends that have shaped the current world into what it is have their birth. It's the Great Depression and
what we now call post-modernity.
Right, exactly. The Great Depression.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're perfectly fine. World War II shortly followed the trajectories that were set in this period, and these trajectories solidify into post-modernity. And then the Iron period, like I said, we can only predict that drastic changes are incoming. But you can play around with this gold, silver, bronze, iron idea, or the 4-3-2-1 idea, and you can apply it to any length of time, and you'll be able to tell with surprising accuracy the quality of the time periods associated with those proportions. It's very interesting. And remember, Robert Bolton lived in the 15 and 1600s, so he predicted, again, with surprising accuracy, the decades of the American and French revolutions, and really everything that came after his time. So I figured that was very interesting, and that would be good to include on this episode. So what are your thoughts on that?
Didn't Nostradamus live just 100 years prior to this fellow as well?
I'll have to look that up. But I believe so. Nostradamus was...
Because I believe...
There were big occult circles in the Renaissance.
And his predictions also go up to, I think, that 3,100 number or something like that Guénon it's kind of calculated. So I wonder if Guénon was going off of some of...
Nostradamus's work.
Some of Nostradamus's work, yeah.
That would probably be very likely, because he was in the French circle, who was, and Nostradamus was a French astrologer.
That would make sense.
Whereas Robert Bolton was an Englishman, so that's very likely. But yeah, Nostradamus, I don't know. He lived in 1503 and he died in 1566. So
so it was okay. So not 100 years, but a few decades prior to Roger Bolton.
Yeah, just a smidge.
I keep saying Roger. Is it Roger or Robert?
It's Robert. Sorry. Robert Bolton.
Robert. Okay. I think I'm thinking of Roger Scruton, which is contemporary theologian. So
Robert
very
Bolton,
cool guy to look into if you haven't heard of him before.
Roger Scruton, you said?
Yes. Also an Englishman.
Let me see. Where's the... I believe it's called The Order of the Ages, in the book in which Robert Bolton details his durations for the different ages. So, if you were looking for a primary source and not, a secondary source such as me, go check out The Order of the Ages. It's actually in our reading list. So, very interesting book. I've yet to read it myself, but I get my information from that one podcast I mentioned, which I should remember to link down below. So, check that out. But without further ado, we can get into the Doctrine of the Four Ages now, the chapter proper, as it were. So, Evola's thesis and the general theme of this chapter is the idea of a regression or of an involution. And this is not just the theme of the Doctrine of the Ages, but it is the theme that surrounds his hypotheses or pseudo-conclusive findings of the evolutionist question, or the question of evolution. So, Evola is very staunchly against the idea of evolution as a scientific theory for explaining the existence of humanity, and he grants authority to the traditional doctrine of decay, or again of involution. So on page 178, I believe he says, upon examining the meaning of each of these periods, it is opportune to anticipate some general considerations. And like I said, each of these periods correspond to the different ages. So like the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. So upon examining the meaning of each of these periods, it is opportune to anticipate some general considerations, since the above-mentioned view is in open contrast to the modern times concerning prehistory and the primordial world. To uphold with tradition that in the beginning there were no animal-like cavemen, but rather, quote-unquote, more than human beings, and that in ancient prehistory there was no civilization, quote-unquote, but an era of the gods. This to many people, who in one way or another believe in the gospel of Darwinism, which is antithetical to tradition, amounts to pure and simple mythology. Since I've not invented this mythology myself, however, critics still have to explain its existence. That is, the fact that according to the most ancient testimonies and writings, there is no memory that may lend support to evolutionism. What is found in them instead is the opposite, in other words, the recurrent idea of a better, brighter, and superhuman, quote-unquote, divine past. And these same testimonies also know very little about the quote-unquote animal origins. Constant mention is made rather of the original relationship between men and deities, and the memory is kept alive of a primordial state of immortality, together with the idea that the law of death appeared at one particular moment. So, Darwinism has been adopted by many of those who are reacting against the liberalist order of today as a supposed antithesis to egalitarianism or materialism. It's the doctrine of the strong or the doctrine of the mighty, and it's usually referred to as the natural order. This is the idea of the survival of the fittest, or natural selection. And according to the doctrine of tradition, and according to Evola, this does not explain the human phenomenon. It is the Darwinistic perspective is one of the steps on the way to progressivism, egalitarianism, liberalism, all of these various common caste-oriented ideologies. And that if you were to use this as your moral reference point, you would be stuck in a world of relativity, pretty much, or atomism, or what I've called relativistic atomism, if you were to use this as your moral reference point. And, according to tradition, and according to the scientific method even, but nothing which is greater can come from that which is lesser. Only that which is lesser can come from that which is greater, according to traditional teachings. And so the ages always decay in line with this idea that what is lesser comes from what is greater, and what is greater comes from the divine, or from the monad, or from the quintessential reality. So, according to tradition, man was not only once immortal, but also was once androgynous. The idea of the sexes appeared, I don't know exactly when in the timeline, but I believe it was before death. But there's this idea that we were once spiritual beings that had a sort of efficacy that was above the necessity for being divided into sexes. And we were unified as one holistic being, and were as divine then as only our soul is now. That's sort of Evola's thesis. And so Evola says, on the one hand, there is the biblical myth of the Ben Elohim, the quote-unquote children of the gods, who mated with the quote-unquote daughters of men, with the consequence that in the end, quote-unquote, all mortals led depraved lives on earth. And then there is, on the other hand, there's the Platonic myth of the inhabitants of Atlantis, conceived as the descendants and disciples of the gods, who lost the divine element and eventually allowed their human nature to become predominant because of their repeated intermingling with human beings. And so this one's interesting because it reinforces the idea of the two broad types of men, the patrician and the plebeian, or the high man and the low man, or the greater idea of a man and the lesser man. High man is directly related to divinity, whereas low man is considered to be telluric and animalistic. So it's interesting here that Evola uses man in two different senses just on instinct, basically saying that that men were conceived as the descendants and disciples of the gods who lost the divine element and eventually allowed their human nature to become predominant because of their repeated intermingling with human beings. So essentially the human nature was something that became fixed onto something that was higher, almost symbiotic to a traditional man being considered as antithetical to humanity. So it should be said that according to tradition, to be human is to be inferior. The state of the human being itself, or of being confined to the humanistic sphere, is not a desirable state. It is not a good one. It's seen as a limiting state that is reduced and removed from the original divine state. So To be human is to be limited and confined to the humanistic sphere. And pretty much the goal of esotericism and the goal of all of these different various traditional paths that Evola has outlined is to transcend the human condition. It's to reduce all that is human to something that is subordinated to a principle that is grafted onto the human being now through initiation or consecration that used to originally be present within the being as something hereditary that is now latent. So, to be human is to be inferior.
Oh man, there's so much I'd like to add on this, but I feel like we could dedicate a whole podcast to, reinforcing Evola's critiques of evolution and this degeneration, especially from various traditions, like in pre-Diluvian biblical depictions of society where, fallen angels did procreate with humanity and create the Nephilim, and they were, the great men or giants of their time and so forth. Same going back to the children of the gods and humans being things like Cyclops or Minotaurs and things like that in Greek mythology and so on and so forth, even in Nordic myths and whatnot. And you get this recurring theme over and over again of these celestial beings that seem to be our progenitors, then intermingling with us and creating these halfway type of degenerations, monstrosities that seem very real and seem to have had a tangible existence in our world, considering their depiction pretty much unanimously across civilizations all around the same time at the beginning of this Iron Age of the the 3000 BCs and so.
Yeah.
But not only that, there's just so much on a scientific critique of evolution as well, looking at the actual studies themselves, looking at the data points, looking at the progression of the fossil records and the gaps thereof. Vox Day did a very good sort of 5 points of contention that he had with evolution that he posted years back. It's still up on his YouTube channel if you want to take a look at that. But like I said, I could dedicate an hour or more to this topic because I've thought long and hard about this, being a scientific-minded person myself, and at one point buying full in to the theory of evolution and calling in my atheist days Christians these sort of low IQ science deniers and whatnot, and then coming full circle back around to go, oh, I guess I was wrong in this regard and swallowed a bit more of a fiction than I once thought. And I'm being vague about it only because if I start to get into it, we'll go on a tangent that will put this into 2 parts of an episode, but I want to leave that for another time, and we will eventually get back around to it because I've made many short posts and writings on different social medias that I've put up that we'll bring up in a later time, but continuing on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of a good place for some of that stuff. This is a part of a book that is, absolutely littered with argumentation for the support of the idea of prehistoric civilizations being far superior to our civilization of today, even though we might have this sort of tangible technology that, we can use as a metric against our predecessors and say, this marks the fact that we are better. Evola gives quite a lot of ground to the arguments that even this sort of technological argument is wrong, and that the ancients did have this sort of technology, but it was more ingrained into their being, and their technology was ritual, and they activated this idea. They activated the ideas of higher realities through, rituals or, divination or there's even scientific proof showing the pyramids having some sort of natural, like just the architecture of the pyramids have some sort of natural inclination to power of some sort. They harness a certain type, like whether it be wind or some type of magnetic pull or whatever it was. The pyramid structure itself is one that is, I don't want to say powerful in its own right, but it is.
That actually kind of gets to the concept of ley lines and how ley lines connect across various different ancient or Neolithic sites across the globe.
Oh yeah, which is why the pyramids are all aligned in the way as they are. It's very interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see the juxtaposition of just how knowledgeable the ancients were, even those who existed within the same Iron Age as us. And how precise they could be on astronomical and geographical phenomena that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to know without some of the instruments that we've only constructed today, and that maybe because of information that they had closer to them, with the possibility of a previous civilization that existed that then collapsed from their own cycles of decadence and devolution, and then they rose up again. With these ancient civilizations like the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and whatnot else, but it's just odd that so many historians of today have just this cognitive blockage in dismissing any type of idea, calling that like woo conspiracy. Pseudoscience and whatnot else. Like, no, that there's other interpretations and explanations for this that try to be rationalized away. But the more and more archaeological evidence or texts or whatever else we find that keeps reinforcing this idea that, yeah, there were societies that predate the furthest back we have records of history today, where the people we call ancient, we're calling these civilizations ancient, and we're calling them far more advanced than what they had. And like Vincent was saying, these previous civilizations, like whatever may existed in this Bronze Age, this Atlantean type of pre-Diluvian civilization, may have had material technology that was on par with, maybe even superior to our own, but also a spiritual technology through their rituals, through their practices, and possibly other things that we just don't have the language or conceptual understanding of, because it's an understanding of the world and of spirituality that has been lost to us because we exist in this dark age. So that's also another thing brought up in the Vedas, and what Dharma Nation has talked about on his podcast before, especially in his examination of the Lord of the Rings, which Vincent actually recommended I watch, and how I got into him. But he was explaining how in the degradation of the ages as it goes on, the preponderance of spiritual beings, what would be called like fays or fairies in European mythology, and all of these other beasts of myth and legend, start to decline in number and prevalence, possibly because some of them are more material and they get hunted out, like say dragons or unicorns or things like that, where valiant knights would go and go dragon hunting or something like that, just to give a rationalistic explanation. But it could be that the spiritual degradation of the very age itself kind of diminishes the ability for these creatures to exist, or maybe even our ability to detect them, and that gets into a whole bunch of different implications as well. And I don't want to go too far off the reservation just quite yet, but it points in that direction a little bit too.
No, absolutely. So the other thing is that, yes, so the increasing materiality of humanity is also, I think, to blame. We as human beings, the divine element that was mixed with the human beings, as it were, in the Platonic, idea of Atlantis, or in the idea of, the Ben Elohim being the children of, or having the children of gods and, children of gods and men and whatnot. this and the ages as it progresses, becoming having this material reference point being the focus of civilization and humanity. I don't think it is in any way accidental or coincidental. And I think that, that chapter on time, where Evola was talking about the qualitative implications of time and how certain time periods emphasize certain aspects of reality, and how every being that is around in that time with such an emphasis feels that emphasis and feels a disposition towards that which that emphasis is upon. All of that kind of legitimizes and reinforces the idea that humanity is becoming increasingly attuned to the physical sphere, increasingly attuned to the material sphere. And
I was going to ask, is there a bit of a chicken and the egg scenario here where the Yuga might be affecting, or the progression of time itself would be affecting humanity, and then imposing this spiritual decay upon them? Or is it mankind ourselves dragging the ages into progression by our own rejection of, or not predetermined, but our not predisposition. Sorry, I'm struggling with the word.
No, it's okay. I know exactly what you're saying.
The pretense for us to go towards this spiritual decay in our own pursuits and attachment to materiality. Which one would affect the other, or which one comes first in this scenario then?
That's a good, yeah. It is kind of like that. That's what I was essentially outlining. And so that goes on to ask the question, is our attunement to material reality sort of like an effect of a sort of poison that is imposed on us from the time period in which we live, right? Like, let's say if we had, you have the time periods that Evola has outlined in his, in the previous chapter that we covered with time and whatnot. He says that time has a sort of qualitative character to it. And so if we take this to be true, and time does have a qualitative character to it, then that means that any being that is in a given time period, which has a certain disposition for a given...
That's the word I was looking for too.
Disposition. Yeah. Oh, you did say disposition then. But if the time period in which a given being exists has a disposition to a given effect, whether that be a spiritual effect or a material effect, then do all the beings that exist within that time period feel that effect as well? Are they affected to it, or are they affected by it as a sort of spiritual poisoning, as it were, or a spiritual boon, were it to be in the golden period? So, for example, you might have a and then go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I wonder if that's what people might refer to as the aether, or this sort of cosmic miasma that is this spiritual dimension to reality that we can't tangibly feel, but still exists and affects physical existence as we see it. It's actually
a theme in the panentheism idea, the panentheist idea, not to be confused with pantheism, but panentheism. Is this idea that metaphysics intersects physics, but is absolutely distinct from it. And there are certain panentheists who will say that certain individuals or certain periods have given affinities for metaphysics over others, and that very obviously translates into the doctrine of the castes, and to say that the priestly caste has a metaphysical affinity whereas the common caste does not. I think that's all very very legitimate and valid, but
it's hard to produce any physical sort of proof for such a thing.
Exactly.
Because it would kind of contradict its very nature.
Exactly.
But that also lends credence into my other thoughts on different creatures that in Dharma Nation's examination of the Vedas, or the Vedic interpretation of Tolkien's, Lord of the Rings, he was bringing up that it's shown not only in the Vedas but in Tolkien's works that certain creatures or certain beings have a higher affinity for or connection to this spiritual nature of reality, and as the ages progress, these beings or these creatures start to fade away or be less populous in the world, and more material beings like human beings start to populate and fill in the world until it's nothing but materiality, and it sort of devolves in on itself. And so I'm wondering if a lot of these fays or fairies or other mythological beings of the past that are recorded throughout the histories of ancient civilizations, like say the Nephilim or the giants and Cyclops and so on across various civilizations, were beings just like that, where they had a higher spiritual propensity, and because the ages shifted into further devolution, these beings could no longer exist materially because their connection to this higher spiritual plane it was cut off or is muddled so much that there is no transposition for them to exist in the material realm, or there's no way for us to detect them in a purely material sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the idea as to whether or not these beings have their footing in all spheres, or do they have their footing in one sphere that allows them to manifest in another, given certain circumstances or given certain conditions, that if these conditions are not present, they're no longer allowed to live there. Like, let's say, for example, I would say that humanity has the most adaptive nature to it. And I think this is partly because of the idea that humanity as divine beings first and foremost, and then as having part of their footing in the material sphere as an animalistic manifestation of the humanly principle, or through what Plotinus calls the soul-body couplement, or the there's another word, the animate, as it were. I think that humanity has more ground, has more footing in either ground, both the spiritual sphere and the physical sphere. And so because of this, I think humanity is a lot more adaptive than beings of a purely spiritual sort. And I think that when this causes the necessity for the question, do the time periods create conditions in which beings who are not as adaptive to the physical reality, or the physical sphere, do time periods in which the emphasis of the physical sphere is greatest create conditions in which these spiritual beings can no longer exist, and the only reason that humanity exists is because of its material nature, which is severed now, as it were, or the connection is very, very hanging by a thread, as it were. And humanity is even in its most material and devolved forms because of these conditions. Almost as though, let's say, you were walking through a desert and everyone else died of water except for the one being, like a cactus, who can survive long periods without water but will still eventually die if that connection remains severed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm guessing you meant die of dehydration instead.
What did I say?
That does die of water.
Yeah, sorry, I was deep in thought. Yeah.
No, totally excusable. Honestly, considering the lengths and depths of conversation that we've gone in so far, that is totally forgivable. But that actually was going towards what I was going to bring up next in humanity's ability to adapt, and this sort of curse that we've brought upon ourselves with technological adaptation, and how our sort of Faustian spirit in the conquest of the material world brings us to developing technologies. And we brought this up in other conversations and critiqued people like Ted Kaczynski on his missing of this prospect of the technological progress of mankind, where, yes, still disastrous effects there, and I'll get to that in a moment, but the generating spirit behind it is a pursuit of conquering the material world, maybe in some sort of subconscious devotion or chasing of a springboard to leap back into a more spiritual world, or to regenerate a new golden age by having this full control of our material surroundings through an extension of ourselves, through technological progress, through this sort of transhumanist type of ideal that many of the contemporary elites that we see in today's society might actually be trying to go towards. And that kind of brings us towards the consequences of it, where this pursuit of technological conquest devolves us even more spiritually, because it is us depending more on the material world, and even decaying our own physical states as a consequence, which lends credence to Kaczynski's critiques of things like the Industrial Revolution and modern society as we see it. But there is a bigger picture element here too, with that whole spiritual battle and decay thereof, with us being dependent on these constricted hyper realities, like we already brought up with the internet, and so many other facets of our daily lives that we depend on for just day-to-day activities, just self-care. We're dependent on so many different nodes of technological or mechanical processes that we might perish without, and that only further exemplifies the detachment we have from these more spiritual understandings of the world.
So you're kind of saying that our modern material technology is sort of like a substitute for the spiritual affinities that we had back then, that we are now severed from, and maybe our access to is very limited. And so in the same sense that we might have access to these technologies, which provide us with the same temporal results, are still of a lesser quality of that version. It's almost like an inferior substitute of sorts. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it's in a way how I'm thinking of it now is do you know the studies where people have taken high-powered magnets and looked at magnets separate from the MRIs that they're taking of people's brains as these experiments are running on, where they have these electromagnetic pulses that interrupt signals in the brain, and they can actually turn off parts of the brain that are associated with people's connection of spirituality and of closeness to God, as is described in some of these studies. I'd have to bring up exactly where they come from, but I remember seeing headlines years back about exactly that. And a lot of people brought up the point that, people were making jokes that atheists are basically brain damaged, essentially, because cut off connections to the brain, and now you can't feel connection with God. Oh, okay, that makes sense. But in a more serious note, that I think that there are more subtle implications to that in technology overall, or even other processes of modern civilization, in just the way in which we act and interact with each other. Even taking out all these pieces of technology, but I guess that's part of the contextual reasons why we interact and act in these ways to modernity, that still bring us further away from this connection of divinity that we once had, or that we fully had at the birth of creation, and we've only moved further from.
It's very interesting that study. It's almost like they have found the antenna that we connect with divinity, that we use to connect with divinity. That's very interesting. Yeah, we've kind of gone off into the weeds a bit here, but yeah, all of these questions can be asked now if the thesis of evolution is sort of rejected outright as being the number one conclusive statement for the existence of humanity. I absolutely think that some of these other ideas are more in line with the traditional teaching, which is evidently correct on many fronts. Like the idea of the regression of the castes, for example, the traditional prediction of that was to a T almost exactly carried out. The same thing with the idea of the ages. Like we've proven in this episode, even if you look at the durations of time and you separate them into divisions of 4, 3, 2, and 1 units, all of these will connect and correspond to significant periods after which the qualitative state of humanity was not as great as it was in the age before, or the period before. Whether that's in a 10-year period or a 20-year period. I mean, you could do this for just for fun with the 2000s up until where we've lived. Let's say 2020 is our cutoff. You could apply this idea to 2000 to 2008, 2008 to 2012, 2012 to 2016 or to 2018, and then 2018 to 2020, and these numerations still correspond to a sort of decline, even if it's observed on a very hyper-specific scale, very zoomed in, as it were. They still correspond to a decline. So this traditional doctrine, this application of the ideas of traditional principles, if they can be proven in this way, then they can certainly be proven in other ways, which is to sort of reject the idea of Darwinism, the gospel of Darwinism, as Evola put it, that something greater could come from something lesser. And from this, we can reject the idea of evolutionism being the sole proponent of humanity, the sole creator of humanity, as it were.
I'm kind of dumbfounded, though, still getting caught up on how easily you just translated that principle of the ages into the 2000s to now.
Yeah.
And it fits perfectly.
It absolutely does. That was quick math.
That's
I don't
crazy.
know if those calculations are correct.
You were off by a little bit, but like it came out to the right numbers.
Right.
But you were off a little bit in the middle. Still, though,
Yeah.
it's that was kind of impressive.
Well,
But I mean, even getting to all this point now, where we're seeing this rejection of what is contemporarily posited as the beginnings of human civilization, or as the human species in general. What is then Evola's counter proposal?
Right.
And do you want to get into the chapter 23, the Golden Age, now, examining exactly that?
Well, I've still got a little bit of
Oh,
notes
no.
left on this.
Oh no!
Left on this. There's some important information still to be found in here. Let's see, on page.
Maybe it will be a two-parter.
That's what I'm saying. Anyways, on
That's
page
what I'm saying.
on page 180, he says that let's see, there are species that retain their characteristics even in conditions that are relatively different from their natural ones. Other species in similar circumstances instead become extinct. Otherwise, what takes place is racial mixing with other elements in which no assimilation or no real evolution occurs. And this is an extension of a quote that he made on 179, which says, "Another mistake of evolutionism is to conceive of some forms of miscegenation that presuppose the emergence of other races that are superior either as civilizations and biological specimens or as products of quote-unquote evolution." So I'll read that again, and I will break it down, because that was kind of difficult to piece together just by the grammar structure, the way he wrote it. So he wrote it as, "Another mistake of evolutionism is to conceive of some forms of miscegenation that presuppose the emergence of other races that are superior to either as civilizations and biological specimens or as products of evolution." So I would rewrite this sentence and say that another mistake of evolutionism is to conceive as civilizations and biological specimens, or as products of evolution, some forms of miscegenation that presuppose the emergence of other races that are either superior, blah, blah, blah. Just the way he wrote it was very, very difficult, but tribal man, in a sense, is not primitive in the sense that he is at the beginning of a technological journey, but in the sense that he is the degenerated residues of a race that was far superior to that which is currently left of it. So he's saying that evolutionism should not say that miscegenation presupposes the emergence of other races that are superior. So the idea of mixing races or mixing castes, or in the prehistoric sense of mixing the various forms of humanity, you have like the Homo sapien or the Cro-Magnon and all of that. These should not presuppose the emergence of races such as we are today that are superior as civilizations or as biological specimens or as products of evolution. These will always inevitably result in the lessening of a given quality. He says that these races, each of these distinct races, had their own origins, and because so much time has elapsed, as in the case of the Hyperborean and Atlantic races, and because of geophysical factors, these races have left very few traces of their existence, and what remains is difficult to spot by those who are merely seeking archaeological and paleontological traces accessible to profane research. So this is his justification for why these civilizations are not able to be found very easily, or why residues of these civilizations are not able to be found very easily. But this is also applicable to the caste system and to caste miscegenation. If the castes mix, let's say a regal caste and a commoner mix, you are likely to get a long line of commoners with certain regal individuals appearing here and there, but their regality is suppressed in comparison to the pure, unbridled regality of someone who is not the product of caste miscegenation. And so this is very important here. The idea that follows, he says that the result of this interbreeding closely resembles the processes that follow Mendel's law concerning heredity. Once it disappears in the phenotype, the primitive element survives in the form of a separated, latent heredity that is capable of cropping up in sporadic apparitions, even though it is always endowed with a character of heterogeneity in regard to the superior type. So this is the one way, I believe, in which the decay can be reset. We were talking about that age of heroes, that fifth age. I believe that the fifth age comes about, or the age of heroes, the race of heroes, as it were, comes about because of this quote-unquote sporadic apparition of this element that is latent in the hereditary lineage of a given person. Which, like I said, if you have a... I just sent a message about this as well. I want to read that also. I said that for every increase in caste, there is a 1,000-to-1 ratio of its members. 1,000 commoners for every 1 merchant, 1,000 merchants for every 1 warrior in the spiritual sense, or priest, and 1,000 warriors and priests for every 1 truly regal individual. And you couple this with caste miscegenation, which means that at most we will only get sporadic apparitions of the higher castes within everyone who is born. If regality miscegenates with a warrior, you are 1,000 times more likely to get a warrior than a regal individual, in the same ratio downwards and so on. Couple all this with the regression of the positions of the castes, and now, on the small chance a regal individual is even born, there's still less of a chance that he won't be born of the low classes and have absolutely no sway in history. So this... I almost want to rescind that last question, or that last accusatory statement of having no sway on history, because perhaps the birth of a regal individual, because of one of these quote-unquote sporadic apparitions, might prompt this sort of reintegration of humanity with his divine nature. But I find that to be very...
Kind of like the Age of the Heroes that we brought up before?
Exactly, yes. I find that to be very interesting. Go ahead.
This whole line that you went down now just reminded me of the genealogy of Noah after the flood as well. Speaking of, Diluvian civilizations and everything, or pre-Diluvian civilizations and everything like that, we see what are meant to be the post-Diluvian sons of Noah with Japheth, Shem, and then Ham, and how they go off in different parts of the world to then father the different tribes of the world, and their descendants become the different races and peoples that we know of today, which I found interesting coming from where you first began that monologue.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also the idea that, so the flood, the the flood that presupposes the antediluvian civilizations and post-diluvian civilizations. This is at the end of the Second Age. So it's at the end of the Silver Age. So you have the Golden Age, the Hyperborean Age. And then after that you have the tilting of the axis. Then you have the Second Age, or the Atlantic Age. And then you have the Flood. And then you have the Third Age, or the age in which all of these different societies start cropping up, these various traditional hubs in the post-diluvian world. And the progenitors of these traditional hubs were said to have a longer life than the other people who lived in these traditional hubs. So it's almost like these were high men coming and creating a traditional hub for low men to participate in. And that
Which
almost
is even again supported with the biblical story of Noah, where he was over 500 years old after the events of the flood, and his sons were all well within their hundreds at that point, and then again went on to father the different peoples of humanity.
Right, exactly. And you brought this up with Lord of the Rings as well. I was going to bring up, at the end of this chapter, I was going to bring up some fantasy, like modern fantasy interpretations of this, but this is actually a very good place to reference the idea that the sinking of Numenor in the Silmarillion corresponds to this catastrophic flood. And the people... Oh, go ahead.
I just want to mention, too, that I think it's a crying shame that Tolkien couldn't see within his lifetime the appreciation of the genius that was in his work, even though he was very sort of stoic in face of what people consider his masterpiece, even though he doesn't even consider it his masterpiece.
Exactly.
But it's just a shame that it took so long for people to realize the depth of inspiration that came and was written down by Tolkien. It's just, what a guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that you can look at his mythology, and you can do this with other fantasy stories as well, but not to the same degree. The fact that you could look at his mythology sort of as its own mythology. It doesn't... You don't need to substitute it or reinforce it with the existence of other mythologies. You simply need to look at it itself. You will find all of the proper traditional elements in there some way or another. And that's what I was referencing here, is this idea of the traditional hubs being brought about by post-diluvian progenitors of antediluvian societies is the story of Numenor. And Numenor is this high men kingdom, and high men have the blood of elves in them. They have this divinity in them. That's what the elves are supposed to represent, this fairiness. And this is what causes them to have long lives. So their connection to the divinity of the elves is what causes them to be more divinely inclined. It's what causes them to live longer. It's what causes their society to be qualitatively superior to the low man which still exists in Middle-earth. And then once the sinking of Numenor happens, you get these survivors who crop up these various Middle-earth kingdoms, such as Gondor, who, and I believe Arnor, it's been a while since I brushed up on my third age history. I believe it was Gondor and Arnor were created by these Númenórean kings. But only the Númenórean line was blessed with this long life, or this divinity. And the low men over which they ruled they were brought up, they were sort of pulled up, as it were, by the presence of the Númenóreans, but they were not anywhere near as potently spiritual or as divine as they were themselves, as the Numenorians were themselves. And so this idea is what characterizes what happened after the real flood in our own timeline, and the creation of these various hubs, which you may find in, let's say, Egypt. Egypt is a fantastic one because it's one of the oldest ones, where the pharaohs were considered to be gods almost because of their long lives. And the people worshiped these pharaohs as if they were gods. And you have in the Greek pantheon gods like Apollo, who were the idea, who was the idea of a sort of Hyperborean solarity. But if you were to compare Apollo with other Hyperboreans, he might just be another Hyperborean that low man would consider to be a god because of his, inclination to divinity. So it's almost as if the caste system is applied, very in different layers. So you have the race of the Hyperboreans, or the race of the high man, which is what the regal caste would be to the common caste, as if the common caste corresponds to the race of low man. And then in each of these different races, you have their own caste system, which divides further into its own sort of hierarchy. So it's the caste system applied on a sort of universalist versus a very particular or condensed scale. I find that very interesting.
And I did want to mention we keep referring to things as, the flood and antediluvian or pre-diluvian societies versus post-diluvian societies, and, the interplay with all these things in the generation of civilization. And a lot of people may be taking this as allusions to the myths that we've talked about, like the biblical stories or Atlantis and things like that. But take a moment to try and understand that we're not referring to this as, fanciful stories that are meant to be like allegorical or didn't necessarily happen. They're far more real and far more likely to have genuinely happened than even some closer historical events to us that we posit as real from the documentation. Just because, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but in chapters 24 and 25, Evola gets into this in far more detail, which is why we say he points to it, but he doesn't make any claims, is the existence of that Mid-Atlantic ridge and Doggerland, what is referred to today as, which existed in this Ice Age, this Bronze Age that occurred in that time period, so many thousands of years ago, that points to various civilizations having existed in parts of the world that no longer are above seawater, because the sea level was about 400 feet lower than it is today, which it's kind of hard to conceptualize. But think of yourself at the beach and then going off miles into the distance,
right?
And now there's no more water. You'd have to walk another like 4 or 5 miles until you hit probably the continental shelves almost of many places, especially in places like Florida or, like I said, in Doggerland, where the English Channel didn't exist. Florida was about 3 times as thick. You could walk from Indonesia to Malaysia to what's the other one? So any of the other countries in any of those island nations in the southeast of Asia, like
Not
these
the
were connected
Philippines,
land
right?
masses. Yeah, the Philippines. Thank you.
Okay.
And that's kind of inconceivable today because there are vast miles of ocean and sea between most of these places now that would be very treacherous to swim across. Sometimes even in bad weather, it is very treacherous to take a boat across. But to think that water just didn't exist in those places in that time is kind of proof to the point that, we have all of our major nodes of civilization on coastlines and along waterways as is. So imagine then suddenly at the end of the Ice Age, where, the poles shift, the climate drastically warms, and the ocean starts to rise up from beneath you and just wipes away most of civilization that existed on the coastlines across the world. And that all just goes away in it could have been years, it could have been months, depending on how quick the ice melted, and considering what we know from the geological time frame, it was very quick. So just putting it into perspective, that there is far more evidence with scientific and historic backing than one might presume in us talking about these things as factually as we've been stating them.
Scientists also agree on the flood being a thing that happened. So even if, these mythological accounts you find disagreeable, the flood did happen, even according to modern science. And
yeah,
it was very obvious. I mean, even if we were to, let's say that all metaphysical implications were null and void, the flood still did happen. And after the flood, there still arose these traditional societies that gathered around an individual who was, to them, seemingly divine. So even if all of these metaphysical implications were null and void, that still did happen. Which means that why would the metaphysical implications be null and void? It's almost like a reinforcement of the idea itself.
Exactly. And which is why it's so difficult to find any evidence of, anything before that point, and why we think civilization only started about 6,000-7,000 years ago is because where we would have had civilization, along the coastlines of what used to be, it would all be under hundreds of feet of water by now. And any other crazy ecological events that might have occurred in between them from, or even, seismic events like tsunamis and earthquakes, tornadoes and hurricanes, and just the swallowing of the land masses by the ocean once again. That's just going to erase everything. And then the amount of time after that is it's not going to be recognizable, even if there did still exist on the bottom of the sea floor evidence of these civilizations. It so much erosion and animal mass and other things will have occurred that we might just think it's some sort of natural geological formation. There could be pyramids in between, the cliffs of Dover and Champagne. Who knows?
Let's not even get started on the pyramids on Antarctica.
Oh goodness! Oh yeah! Oh no! Yeah, this is going to be too long as is.
So yeah, just to get back to the chapter, he says that evolutionists believe they are positively sticking to the facts. They ignore that the facts per se are silent, and that if they were interpreted in different ways, they can lend support to the most incredible hypotheses. And this is most definitely true because facts can always be presented as supportive of almost any hypothesis. However, as I said in the beginning, truth itself cannot be so mutilated. But Evola goes on to mention a thesis by a man named Douglas Dewar, presented in a piece called The Transformist Illusion, which debunks Darwinistic evolution quite well. I would recommend giving that a read also. It's been a while since I've taken a look at that text, but it is very good to supplement this chapter with that text, so if you have access to it, do so.
What was that one more time?
It is called The Transformist Illusion by Douglas Dewar. And it is a very interesting piece. So, let's see here. There's a piece I wanted to read on page 181. Sorry, give me 1 minute here to figure out where it is. Here we go. The absence of human fossils and the sole presence of animal fossils in remote prehistory may be interpreted to mean that primordial mankind, provided that we may call primordial man a type that would be very different from historical mankind. Primordial mankind was the last form of life to undergo the process of materialization, which process endowed the earlier animal-like human species with an organism capable of being. So, the thesis mentioned by Douglas Dewar was the idea that the animal species, dogs, cats, whatsoever, were offshoots of the attempted couplement of the human soul with the human body, the imperfection that arose from the various experiments. He says that I am referring to the thesis according to which man is not alone in being far from a product of evolution of animal species, but many animal species must be considered as the offshoots or as the abortions of a primordial impulse, which ultimately resulted in the success of humanity. Only in the racially superior human species does this primordial impulse find its direct and adequate manifestation. So that was a very interesting thesis, and I had to give that book a read once I read that the first time. Then he goes on to say that some traditions, according to some traditions, humanity had weak or soft bones, and this is why you don't see the presence of archaeological sites and whatnot for, let's say, in the same way we might have dinosaur bones. You don't have like older human bones, according to the Chinese tradition of Lei Su referenced the Hyperboreans as having soft bones, so things like that.
Yeah, it was also a point that Evelyn made that in these civilizations, solar and lunar types, there wouldn't be burial rites, there'd be burning rites instead, as an ascendant form of, the passing on of life, because your ashes rise instead of, you being buried. Actually, no, I think he makes the distinction that lunar civilizations started to bury their dead, whereas solar burned them in pyres or cremation or so forth. But also on that fact is fossilization and things where if things weren't preserved rapidly and in a specific way, then the surrounding materials, especially biological life forms and different organic compounds like oxidants would just eat away any biological material over the course of time, not even bones or things like that, which is why many dinosaur fossils are rare to find, especially full skeletons, is because unless something was buried very rapidly in like very specific materials, like say something like limestone, which is a softer stone, but it doesn't have any sort of oxidizing chemicals to eat away at things like your bone matter and whatnot, which even still could preserve some other types of biological matter. We found most recently I'm lapsing on the name of the dinosaur, but the dinosaurs with even imprints of their skin and armor plates on them that otherwise would have been eaten away if they hadn't been preserved in those exact type of ways. So if people of these ancient societies were buried, and they were buried in environments that were very lush and verdant and had different oxidizing factors to them, no evidence of that would remain at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. That coupled with the fact that even up until the Viking Age, you might have traditions which which had individuals send their dead out to sea, and we might find bones that don't wash up on shore or something like that, or are taken by some sea monster or something, eaten far out at sea or still drifting in the Atlantic or what have you.
Now if they're burned, then they're ash. You can't discern that, especially not thousands of years later. If they're put out to sea, that's even more just dispersed over the global currents. And if they're buried, then even if we might find sites of burial being materially different depending on chemical composition or disturbance of the soil or things like that, or markers for headstones, and who knows what other means we could find as evidence of burial, there wouldn't be any evidence of the actual person or beings that were buried there, because so much time has passed that the earth around it just ate it up and turned it into raw nutrients. And even those things probably got eroded and shifted and sifted all throughout the land, probably spanning miles, depending
Worm
on
food and
where
soil.
the weather takes it. Yeah.
I want to go back
So
to the quote here that I read. There are species that retain their characteristics even in conditions that are relatively different from their natural ones. Other species, in similar circumstances, instead become extinct. That actually, I read it and I made the connection the first time I read it, but what we were talking about with the conditions of time, severing the beings of that time and the human principle that exists within it from this divine reality, kills off some beings, but it allows humanity to adapt, even if it is an inferior or
that's true.
involution.
I didn't even think of that, and I read that part from the chapter like 3 or 4 times, just because I was going, that's interesting. And then that whole separate idea, completely independent of that passage.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't even think of it until I read it. I read it the first time here, and I made that connection. Then I was like, wait a minute, that's true. So yeah, all of what we went off on that big tangent on was legitimated by that quote there, which I find very interesting. Now on
We have a
page,
habit of getting ahead of ourselves.
we do. On page 182, he says, rather, it seems to me that, quote unquote, the caveman itself is a legend. It seems that, quote unquote, primitive man did not employ caves, many of which betray a sacred orientation, as animal like dwellings, but as places of a cult that has remained in this form even in undoubtedly civilized eras, such as the Greek Minoan cults of caves and the ceremonies and the initiatory retreats on Mount Ida. It is only natural to find therein only traces as a natural protection of the site, which in other sites the combined work of time, men, and the elements did not leave behind for our contemporaries. So he says that caves were not animalistic dwellings. And tradition sort of reinforces this. They were not. They were gathering places for the various cults that populated the world of tradition. And this in conjunction with the other reasons that there would be little to no physical remnants of traditional society is the reason that these caves leave only residues and not something more. Now, this also is another very important point. Let me see here if I can find the passage 183. Maybe it's not 183. Ah, yeah, it's 182. Okay, my notes were wrong. All right, well, according to a very basic traditional idea, generally speaking, the state of knowledge and of civilization was the natural state, if not of mankind in general, at least of certain primordial elites. And knowledge was not constructed and acquired, just as true kingship did not originate from below. So, the evolutionary thesis and mindset deems that civilization is an elevated state of humanity, accessed by progress, and that the basic state of humanity is savage and sort of this primitive barbarism. And this is reinforced by Thomas Hobbes and the idea of the social contract. It was Hobbesian liberalism which gave prominence to this idea, Hobbes being the grandfather of liberalism, as it were. And his justification for the social contract, which is the idea that man enters into a voluntary contract with the government, sort of as the consent of the governed in principle. And he legitimizes the social contract because of man's primitive, savage, barbarian state. And his sort of thesis was that government is a development of this primitivity, is a product of progress, and that civilization is also therefore a product of progress. But according to the traditional teachings, very obviously this was not the case. Civilization is the natural state, and everything else is an involution or a regression from this natural state. And the reason is because that humanity derives its being from this divine, sort of monad, this sort of principle, where all things derive their being. And then it is ordered from the top down, with God in mind, or with godly beings in mind. Think of the worship of various, like I said, the various cults that worshipped the post-Diluvian progenitors, or even, let's say, the Hyperboreans, who worshipped their most powerful figure. So, very, very, it was very interesting, that piece right there. And then one last thing is that he reinforces the idea that I made earlier with the quote, "Today, the aristocratic idea that mankind has higher origins, namely a past of light and of spirit, has been replaced by the democratic idea of evolutionism, which derives the higher from the lower, the man from the animal, the civilization from barbarism. And this is not so much the objective result of a free and conscious scientific inquiry, but rather one of the many reflections that the advent of the modern world, characterized by inferior social and spiritual strata, and by man without traditions, has necessarily produced on the intellectual and cultural plane. Thus, we should not delude ourselves. Some positive superstitions will always produce alibis to defend themselves. The acknowledgement of new horizons will be possible not through the discovery of new findings, but rather through a new attitude towards these findings." So this is, again, the quote I made earlier about the idea of the hypotheses and about facts supporting truths and facts supporting opinions. All of that gets culminated within that last quote there. But we are coming up on 2 hours for this very short chapter. And you know what's funny is when I wrote in my notes, because normally when I write notes, I write them out. I title the note. I title it for the chapters that we're going to cover in the episode. And for this one, I just wrote chapter 22 because I didn't know how far we were going to get. And when I had started taking notes for this chapter, I hadn't planned on covering through 27. I just started going with chapter 22. So the title for this note page itself is Revolt Against the Modern World, Part 8, Chapter 22. not Chapter 22 through 27 and whatnot. So I guess I had some sort of divine intuition that we would be talking about this one chapter for 2 hours. But I think this is a good place to wrap up. Do you have anything else to say?
I mean, the length at which we did speak about all these things did catch me by surprise, but we did at least touch upon the chapters that we will be getting to in the next episode, or the next part of this episode, if we want to be technical. As we said, a habit of getting ahead of ourselves, but I think this is definitely one of the most interesting and probably one of the most fun conversations we've had discussing Evola and the implications thereof, putting down all the foundations for where the origins of what get our whole movement itself in the actual history of humanity, and how all of these concepts that we've been going over sort of apply from this point here. So I guess I should have seen too that just in these very few pages we were going to be talking about a lot. I just didn't expect it to go in these seemingly schizophrenic directions that we have had.
No, absolutely
gone down.
Yeah, it was hard to predict. I did have a feeling that this episode would take quite some time. I was preparing for a 3 or 4 hour episode if we were to cover everything that we had planned to cover.
We're not going to put you through that, audience.
Absolutely. So this is a good place to stop. And then next episode we will pick up with chapter 23, the Golden Age, and we will hopefully carry it to chapter 27, which is the Civilization of the Mother. So we'll cover 23, 24, 25, 26, 27 next time. And I don't think there is as much material to cover in those chapters. This is just, it's detailing the histories we've alluded to and sort of set up in this episode. I think this episode is a good predecessor to what will come next episode. So yeah, that's what we'll touch upon next time. But if you have enjoyed the episode, consider giving it a like if you think it deserves it. And it absolutely does. So go ahead and give it a like. Subscribe to the channel and follow our social medias, the links of which will be in the description down below. Thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
My name is Vincent, and we hope to see you back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.